Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I want to take a break from my typical hardware reviews and tutorials and actually talk about video games today. I know it's a weird concept, but I never really dedicate time to actually talk about the games themselves, and so we're going to do that here today. Now, there are a ton of topics related to video games, and probably the easiest would be, my favorite games for every system or whatever, and I do want to make videos like that, but today let's do something a little bit different. So I want to talk about 5 games that really shaped the way that I approach video games in the first place and taught me some valuable lessons. And I think most people have had similar experiences to me where they play a game and it really just kind of shifts their way of thinking, it's a bit transformative. And so I'm going to talk about my 5 favorite games in that regard. So if you want to hear more, grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, we're going to tackle this chronologically, so we'll start with some of the older games and then work our way up from there. We're going to start with Super Mario Bros. 2 on the NES. Now, I've said this a lot, but this is one of my favorite games of all time. Not only just the gameplay itself and how innovative it is, but also the circumstances that surrounded its launch. Now, the game came out in September of 1988, so I was 8 years old at the time, but another big thing that happened in that same year was that Nintendo Power magazine first came out. I remember the very first issue coming out right before school ended for the summer, so around June of 1988, and on the cover was Super Mario Bros. 2. And the very existence of the Nintendo Power magazine was kind of a marvel at the time. Up until that point, anytime I heard about a new game was either from somebody telling me about it, or going to our local video rental store like Blockbuster and seeing it on the shelves, and so we never really got a heads up about any upcoming games until they just arrived on the store shelves. But that issue of Nintendo Power had a full spread talking about this new upcoming game, Super Mario Bros. 2, and it looked amazing. These sprites were so big and fantastic looking. And I remember sitting on the school bus reading somebody else's issue of that magazine, because we didn't have it, and just being wowed at the graphics and the idea that we were seeing this game before it even came out. And so Super Mario Bros. 2 was the very first video game that I ever got hyped for, where I heard about it ahead of time. And so that was a really big thing for me. I remember asking my parents for it for Christmas that year, but I knew about it ahead of time, which was just kind of crazy. And the cool thing too is that once we got our hands on it, which I think was that Christmas, it absolutely hit every single wicket we were hoping it would. The game felt like a huge leap from the original Super Mario Brothers in terms of just overall gameplay, like the fact that you could grab things and throw them at people, and you could go into the dream world and level up your guy, or that you could pick 4 different people. And then also the graphics were crazy as well. It just looks so much more mature as a game compared to the original. And so the lesson that Mario Bros. 2 gave to me is that sometimes it's pretty awesome to be part of that whole hype cycle, to hear about something and maybe see some teasers or glimpses of it, and then all of a sudden be able to play it later on. And so I think we still see that today with our trailers and gameplay trailers. Then the game actually launches, we all read the reviews. All that's part of that same cycle, and I really enjoy it. And to be honest, it's one of my favorite aspects of this hobby in particular, is to look at the games as they develop and get an idea of what it's going to be like, and then see if they actually hit that mark later on, because that's always fun when it actually does. Okay, now the second game I want to talk about is Dragon Warrior for the NES, which is very closely tied to this whole Nintendo Power experience that I had as a kid. Back in 1988, in order to sell a bunch of issues, they were trying to get people to do 1-year subscriptions. And one of the perks of doing a 1-year subscription is that it would come with a free NES game, which was Dragon Warrior. Now, like I mentioned earlier, we didn't have this magazine growing up. I just had to read it from other people. But one of my close friends, his name was Nick, he had that year-long subscription and he got Dragon Warrior. And I remember there was one night in particular where I went to go stay over at his house, a very common thing in 1988. And we started playing Dragon Warrior, and it just blew our minds because it was so different than any other game we had played before. Up until then, most of the games that we had played on the NES were modeled after the entire arcade ecosystem, which means that it's driven by putting in quarters. So you get 3 lives when you start your game, maybe a couple continues, and that's about it. But Dragon Warrior was a different game. It was the first role-playing game that I had ever played, where you have your character and then you build him up and get stronger and stronger, and then play through an entire story. And I remember after that first night of playing it, I called my parents and I said, can I stay over one more night? Because we've got a lot more game to play. And my parents were totally cool with it. So we were able to knock out that entire game in like one long extended weekend. And I think that was awesome. So that's the thing that Dragon Warrior taught me, is that there was more to games than just trying to get good and kind of finish out each level. Instead, you can actually make the story yourself. And, I hadn't played any other role-playing game up until that point, and so it was a big revelation for me. In fact, back then, we didn't even mind grinding. It was so exciting to just level up your character that we didn't really care. We'd fight all those slimes, try to get as much experience as we could, and then just kind of move on and get better equipment, and then just keep going. And every once in a while, when I do want to play a role-playing game, it's usually Dragon Warrior that I will pick up. Not because I think it's some sort of amazing story arc or anything, but I still don't really mind that grind. And I think part of that is just the nostalgia of going back to 1988, but it is really cool that here we are, 30 plus years later, and it still resonates with me today. Okay, one more game from the NES era is going to be Shadow of the Ninja. Now, this one is not a very well-known game, and honestly, I don't remember how we got it in our house, but all of a sudden it appeared and we owned it. I actually still have my original cartridge from back in the day. Now, this game is very similar to other more popular games like Ninja Gaiden, in the sense that, you just play as a ninja and you can kind of go through these side-scrolling levels, and that's about it. However, there is some remarkable depth to this game in that you can level up your own weapons as you're going through each level. It kind of feels almost like a mixture between Gradius, which has like that same kind of level up system, but then also, Ninja Gaiden or even Super Mario Brothers, something like that. And again, I'm not really sure how we got the game in the first place. I imagine it was probably one of my older brothers who had asked for it, but I'm not even sure how they heard about it either. It was one of those games where if one of the neighborhood kids would come over, we'd say, hey, we should play this game, but they'd be like, no, let's play Mega Man, let's play Mario, or whatever, and we'd have to insist and be like, no, let's try this one out, it's actually pretty fun. And sure enough, everyone seemed to love it once they had tried it out. And the lesson that this game taught me is that sometimes within any sort of sphere, there are hidden gems that maybe you just don't hear about, especially back then before the internet and all that. It was all word of mouth, but this is one of those games that really didn't ever breach over that surface. And so what this game taught me was to make sure to check out every game that you can, because you never know what's actually going to resonate with you. And Shadow the Ninja is one of those games where not everybody has played it, but I find it to be awesome. I think it's a hidden gem. And I think the spirit of this game still follows me throughout other types of media. Even if it's a book or a movie or an album, I always am trying to find something new that really resonates with me. It doesn't really matter whether or not the thing is successful or, popular. All that really matters to me is whether or not it's good. And I think that Shadow the Ninja is exactly in line with that. It's a game that was not very popular, but it is exceptionally good. And if you haven't tried it before, I would definitely recommend it. Okay, so those three games are mostly in the retro era, but now I want to talk about some stuff that's a little bit more modern. So we're going to jump up to around 2000, 2001 with the PlayStation 1 and Final Fantasy 9. Now, I mentioned it before, but there's kind of a gap in my retro gaming. So basically from like 1994 to 2000, I didn't really play any games at all. I was getting through high school, playing in bands, getting a job, and then finally joining in the Navy. And so lots of stuff going on, and I just didn't play games during that time. However, by around 2001, I did end up picking up a PlayStation 1 just to try out some of those games that I had heard about. And I'd always heard about the Final Fantasy series, and so that's when I chewed through all of them really quickly. So I started with 7, then went on to 8, and then on to 9. And even though I loved 7 and 8, and I think they are amazing experiences, it was 9 that I actually ended up liking the most. And it really didn't have to do completely with the game itself, but rather how I personally approached it. And if you remember RPGs around that time, you were allowed to actually name your characters whatever you wanted. And with Final Fantasy 7 and 8, I just kind of went with these standard names that came with the game. But with Final Fantasy 9 in particular, I did something different, where I named the main characters myself, and then I used all the friends that I had at the time, and then filled in their names for the other characters. And it's such a little thing, but it really did personalize the experience for me. And so to the point where I don't really know the names of the characters of that original game, because I think of them as my friends, like I associate them with each friend with each of their respective character. And I remember that I worked with a lot of these people at the time, and so I would come into work the next day and be like, hey, you'll never believe what you did in the video game last night. Like, I just kind of took it personally, but that was part of the fun of it for me as well. And so now all of a sudden, instead of these characters going on an adventure, it was me and my friends. And that amount of personalization really just stuck with me over the years and was still one of my favorite gaming experiences of all time. And so I would say that the lesson I learned from Final Fantasy IX was that I could play games on my own terms. Even though I respect, the way the developers make it and whatnot, it's really the gameplay that I'm going to experience, and so I can tailor that as much as I want. A more modern example of this exact same phenomenon is playing Last of Us Part 2. Now, the original Last of Us, I actually never finished. I played it about 2/3 of the way through, and then resorted to actually watching it on YouTube for the rest, because I was just overwhelmed by the game. It was so heavy. The difficulty was really hard for me, even on the easiest setting, and so I just wasn't enjoying myself. It was a slog, it was work. And so I thought, you know what, I'd rather just see how this story unfolds without all of these stressors that are coming my way. And I freely admit that I'm not very good at many video games. Like, even my 16-year-old son will watch me play and be like, Dad, you kind of suck at this. I'm like, hey, it's the best that I can do. But things were different with The Last of Us Part 2. They had a ton of accessibility options that were baked into the settings, and you could just turn them all off, or you could tweak them to whatever you would like. And so I remember when that game first came out, I bought it and played it on the PS4, and I tweaked all those settings to make sure that it was a gameplay experience that I actually enjoyed. I think a lot of people would probably find it too easy, but for me, it was just right. It was kind of like a Goldilocks experience. And so I think that fits in that exact same spirit that I'm talking about here with Final Fantasy IX, in that you can personalize the game and tailor it to your experience. After all, you're the one that's playing the game. And that's a valuable lesson that it taught me, not to feel bad about playing the game as easy or as hard as I want, but rather just to make it the most enjoyable experience possible. And Final Fantasy IX taught me about that. Okay, we've only got one game left. I'm actually going through this pretty quickly. I'm surprised because I'm fairly long-winded, but let's talk about Lumines on the PSP, which came out back in 2005. And another quick story time here is that about a month before the PSP first came out, I actually had a stroke. I've talked about this in other videos before, but essentially I lost all fine motor function on my left side. It was a freak thing that happened when I was 24 years old. And after that had happened, I had about 2 months where I was not allowed to do anything. I basically was just going through rehab and trying to learn how to walk and write and just kind of function as a human again. It was really weird. And smack dab in the middle of all that stuff, my PlayStation Portable came out. I had pre-ordered it several months before, and I finally had it in my hands. And one of the launch games that I had was Lumines. Now, this is a puzzle game that was first released on the PSP, but then was reiterated many times since then. And essentially, it is a dropping tile game where you're trying to make a 2x2 grid, and then also there's like what they call the timeline that goes across, and that'll basically make those blocks disappear as you go across. And the thing I liked about this game the most was that it was relatively slow paced. Like I mentioned, I was recovering from a stroke at the time, and so I was not ready to jump into like a platforming game, but something like Lumines actually worked. The game does pick up and get a little bit harder as you go through it, but it takes quite some time to get there, and so I could usually knock out, a good 20-30 minutes of gameplay and really enjoy myself the entire time. And there's a couple things that this game taught me, but I think number one and most important is that I started to enjoy the game for enjoyment's sake. Instead of trying to get a high score, trying to get as far along as I could, I just enjoyed the experience, the mix of the music as well as the gameplay. It was just a relaxing time. And so I wasn't really thinking about whether or not I could beat the game. That's something I have never done with any of these games, but I've just enjoyed the moment as it happens. And so this was an excellent reminder to me that sometimes a game is not about, finishing the storyline or getting the highest score, beating one of your friends. Sometimes it's all just about the experience itself and how you can spend some time in somebody else's work and just enjoy yourself. And another thing this game taught me is that sometimes games can be therapeutic, and it depends obviously in the circumstances and the game itself, but Lumines was definitely one of those games for me. It allowed me to just kind of zone out, enjoy the moment, and just kind of get through that really rocky period in my life. And even today, I still love playing Lumines. I think it's one of the best PSP games ever made, and to be honest, I've never played Lumines 2. I always just stick with the original, but it's probably something I should try out. Of course, I've tried like the PS Vita version 1 and the PS3 one as well. Those are all great too, but I got a special place in my heart for that original one on the PSP. So I think that's really about it. I don't want to drag this out too much, but I wanted to share just 5 games that have taught me a lot about life and the different circumstances that surrounded my gameplay experience and what I remember from them. And I'd really love to hear about some games that you have tried that have given you a learning experience as well, where you're playing a game and then all of a sudden it just makes a little tweak or a twist in the way that you were thinking about video games in general. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.